Hi, this is Godfrey Cheshire. I am here to moderate the discussion about the film Desert One by Barbara Kopple. I'm very pleased to be here doing this as a film critic who's written a lot about Iran and has visited Iran a lot of times. I think this is an incredibly great and important film. So I'm glad to be here talking to Barbara Kopple, the director of the film, along with producer Eric Forman and two of the participants in the film, two of the interviewees. One from the people who were held hostage, Kevin Hermening, and one of the attempted rescuers, James Roberts. It's really an honor to be speaking to all of you. And Barbara, I'll start by saying that I think this is an amazing film on a couple of levels. One is it's a very, very moving and powerful human story, dramatic and tragic. And the other thing is that it's an incredibly important story, I think, about American history, and one that Americans don't know about nearly as well as they should, because I really think that since the end of the Vietnam War, 9/11 and these events that are told about in your film are probably the ones that have had the biggest impact on the world. And Americans, I think, still don't understand the relationship with Iran. How did you get into this film? What brought you to it?
Well, the History Channel, who will be showing it, and we're also going to be getting a theatrical distribution from Greenwich Entertainment, wanted to do 100 features of history films. And this was one of the topics that they showed us. And we started digging and we loved it. And so we said we want to do Desert One, Eagle Claw. And they said, absolutely. And that's what started the whole process.
Well, when you started looking at this as a subject to treat, what were the things that initially struck you, and what were the things that you decided you wanted to most sort of look into and emphasize?
Well, I've done films on the military before. I did a film called Winter Soldier, which was about Vietnam veterans. And I also did one called Shelter, which was about homeless veterans in, Iraq and Vietnam and other wars. And I guess I liked the idea of being able to film these very extraordinary, tough guys and get them to really talk about their feelings and their emotions. And I'm an intimate filmmaker, and that was what I wanted. I wanted to hear their story, because they had sort of kept the story, some of them silent. And we were on almost the 40th anniversary. And I just wanted it to all come out. And I loved it because people really opened up and talked to me and allowed me to tell their story.
Right. Well, I think the thing is very timely in a lot of ways, and especially it's good that you got all these people while they're all still there. And in the case of President Carter and Vice President Mondale, those people will not be with us forever, and it's really great to have their memories and their thoughts, so well recorded. Did you? Were there things about the story that surprised you when you went into it? Because actually, you're telling two stories here. You're interweaving, and I think you do a great job at this. The story of the hostage taking, all the political things surrounding that, with the story of the attempted rescue.
Right. Well, I think we did that, and we also did inside the Carter administration. We also got these audio tapes that nobody had ever heard before, because it was supposed to be a silent mission. And Carter and Mondale were getting information, from the front. And it really put, I think, the characters right there. You were right in the middle of what was happening by hearing these audio tapes of the progress of the mission.
Right. And how did you get those tapes?
A woman never tells all her secrets.
Deep research. The exhaustive research goes into a film like this. You have to look, under every corner and in every box. And we were excited to find them.
Eric, were you involved in the research as well as producing the film?
Sure
yes.
Was.
Yeah. Both. When you start a film like this, read every book, read every article. Track everybody down. Figure out how you want to tell the story. So it really was an exhaustive process. And we had a great team at Cabin Creek, helping.
Well, Barbara, one of the things that you can't go into every detail of this big story, but one thing that I was interested in was there was a coup in 1953 that you mentioned that the CIA installed the Shah, but it doesn't mention that it overthrew a democratically elected government there, which was a big thing to a lot of Iranians. And it connects with what happens in this story, which is that also you don't go into, which is why the Carter administration decided to let the Shah into the United States for medical treatment. I understand that the State Department was really against that, and that it was pressure from like David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger, but it made the Iranians think that there was going to be another coup, that the Americans were going to attempt a coup again like 1953 and reinstall the Shah. And that was a huge deal with why all this happened. Would you agree?
I would agree. I think that they wanted the Shah back immediately and get him out of there. And also, too, I think Carter probably did that because every single president had befriended the Shah. But maybe James or Kevin can have more insight on this.
Yeah, I'd like to hear from both of them. James, can we start with you about your view of how all this sort of got sparked?
Well, my belief is that the Shah that knew that he was deathly ill, even when he left in January.
Yeah.
He was drawn and haggard and looked terrible. And then he knocked around, I can't remember exactly, went to Panama and then went a few other places. And I think the Carter administration view was that it was completely unfeasible of putting the Shah or his son back on the throne, but that he had been a good ally for a long time, and that the least we could do was provide him the best of medical support for his cancer and his eventual death. Now, I think on the Iranian side, they interpreted that differently.
Yeah.
And so, as seems to be perennial in our relationship with Iran, people are talking past each other ad nauseum, often with heartfelt feelings on each end that neither end understands.
Right. And Kevin, you were there in Tehran when the Shah was admitted to the United States. So what were you and your colleagues thinking? Did that seem to be the explosive thing that it became, or was that kind of a surprise to you all?
Well, as a Marine Guard, of course, we weren't involved in any political discussions. We weren't privy to what was going on with the State Department, though the ambassador, or in this case, the acting ambassador, the Charge d'Affaires, Bruce Langan, and his team did bring the security officer and the senior Marines into his offices for discussions about preparedness and in the event there would be riots or there might be an attack on the embassy, but never in anybody's wildest imagination, at least from the conversations with us on the ground at the time, was there this belief that the embassy would be seized and that the Iranian government would really, not essentially, in fact, stand down. Back earlier in the year, before I ever arrived in Tehran, the embassy was overrun on Valentine's Day, actually, just coincidentally, but by virtue of knowing when the date was. And the embassy was overrun. It was attacked. One of the Marine Guards was shot, actually, in the head, Sergeant Kenneth Krause. He has fully survived, recovered, I should say, thankfully. But at that time, the Iranian government did its job under millennia of international law, and they came to the embassy compound, they cleared it of the Iranian protesters, and they allowed the Americans to go back about their daily working lives. That didn't happen in November of 1979. In fact, the day after we were captured, the entire Bazargan government resigned, and the Ayatollah from that point forward took responsibility for everything that would happen over the next 444 days total.
Yeah. it's amazing that you guys survived that. I think you're all like amazing heroes to have done it. I do think, thinking back on Mark Bowden's book about this, there was a lot more detail about how badly you were treated, a lot of you. What's your perspective on that from this distance?
Well, I would say that there were colleagues of mine who certainly had much worse treatment than I. Men such as Tom Ahern and Bill Doherty, these men working with the agency endured 425 days in solitary confinement. I don't know how they did it. I spent 43 days in solitary following a failed escape attempt in a small 5-foot by 10-foot room. And the only time I ever got out of that room was to use the bathroom facilities on their timetable about once a day, and then 3 times in that 6 weeks to take a shower. But 425 days is almost, it's amazing that they came out of it as well as they did. Men like Colonel Scott, Army Colonel Charles Scott, beaten so severely around the head that he had 3 of his teeth broken off at the gum lines. And finally, men like Bill Keogh. Bill Keogh, a 6-foot 9-inch tall, 325-pound giant of a man, ended up losing about 200 pounds of his body weight, and of course died less than 2 years after we were freed. And now he had Lou Gehrig's disease, or it certainly was exacerbated because of the stress of our time in captivity. But without a doubt, his experience, I think none of us who were there and none of us who know the story, including Barbara and Eric, who've put so much effort into this, will ever be the same knowing what some of the men went through. I would say, lastly, the issue of being considered heroes, that none of the hostages feel that way about ourselves. We were survivors. We were fortunate to have gotten out of there. And it was pressure by certainly the Carter administration and maybe a little bit of fear of the Reagan administration that ultimately led to the negotiated release on the inauguration day in 1981. But the real heroes, I know we're going to talk about it, were an important subject of this film. The 8 men, the 3 Marines and 5 airmen who didn't survive and left behind dozens, hundreds of family members, parents, children, spouses, brothers, sisters. They were the real heroes in the hostage crisis.
So James, what was your feeling about experiencing what happened and then also seeing the film?
Oh, well, experiencing what happened, I believe that everybody involved in the mission recognized that it was an extremely long shot. The various partial rehearsals that we had done were never up to par, but we felt, I think, I know I felt, and many others felt, that the behavior of the Iranians taking diplomats hostage and holding them so long was so different than what history calls for. That we owed it to the hostages, we owed it to the nation to give it our best try. And so I think it was in that spirit that that we volunteered and went and tried.
And now as you look at the film, I mean, was the film close to what had happened, or what?
Yeah, I believe, you know, I need to remind everybody that I was a relative bit player in this, and that others who are in the film, like Bucky Burris and Wade Ishimoto and Ed Seifert and others, played a larger role. But I think the film does a very good job of reflecting the details of the attempted raid, the details of the abort decision, and the details of the accident post the abort decision. And in that vein, I think it does an admirable job of describing for the public what occurred on that night.
Right. People have said that it feels like a thriller. That some people were on
Well,
the
when you're standing there on the ground waiting for the helicopters, it feels like a thriller, you bet.
and
Hey,
also
Barbara,
yes.
you know, James is being a little bit modest,
Of
which
course,
is,
like you too.
of course, what we would expect of a guy who put himself into harm's way.
Yes.
And I would say that, as you know, Barbara, from some of the other events that we have done together, these guys who were willing to give all, and some of their colleagues did, and some men will never fully physically nor emotionally recover from what they experienced that night in the desert 200 miles south of Tehran. I heard them talk about, with great emotion, including in the film, how they feel they failed, you know. And I understand that if your goal was to make sure that 52 Americans, or at the time 53 Americans, were flown out of danger along with the rescue team, that element of it did not succeed.
Right.
So I get why they might use the word failure, but what they didn't know at the time, and frankly couldn't have known at the time, and I'm just sad for many of them, it took 40 years to understand that to a great degree, once we American hostages on the ground in captivity realized that they had tried,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
that gave us the hope that, number one, we weren't forgotten. Number two, there might be another effort. Number three, if there were men willing to try, and in the case 8 of them die trying to free us, we can certainly endure another, what turned out to be another 8 months, 9 months. And so in that respect, there was an element of success.
Yes.
And, you know, I've heard from some of the men, you know, that were involved in it, in the mission, telling me when they saw me at the events this past fall, gosh, and from some of the wives, gosh, if only they had had that knowledge that that's what kept us going over the last 40 years, they would have, in some cases, had a much different life themselves.
Yeah, I think also too, when hostages thank the people who were on the mission, it's very emotional for them, and makes them feel so exceedingly good that, as they say, they had the guts to try. And as you talked about it, it gave you hope. But here you were, 19 years old, right? Never had even heard of Tehran. And there you were amidst all of this, and your mother came. I mean, how did you feel about all that?
Well, you can imagine how surprised I was when suddenly the Iranians brought me into a room and sat me down on a sofa, as you depicted it and had the interview in the film, and understanding and realizing that, you know, halfway around the world, suddenly your mom shows up. And, you know, I spent the next several days, next few weeks, fearing for her life, because I had no idea really, you know, what was being done to her. Were they going to let her go home? Not being a mom, I couldn't really grasp and understand the emotional pull of a mom to want to risk her own life to be able to see her son potentially for the last time. And as we've talked about, several of the other hostage parents and wives were interested and willing to do the same thing, but they couldn't get their visas. And so my mom was able to persevere with my stepdad and the attorney who accompanied them from Virginia, representing them, if you will, a couple media folks, and there she was in Tehran. And it was a great relief to see for her to see that, I was all right. I had lost a little bit of weight and was quite haggard looking myself, but really, I think as I described in the film, was it the wisest thing that my mom had ever done? Probably not, but I can't replace what a mom might be willing to do.
Right. And James, you went to Iran with your father and enjoyed the skiing and also spoke Farsi. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, I went with my father after the Shah had shut down the British control of much of the production of Iranian oil. And the Shah expelled the Brits, I think, in about 1957. From 57 to 58, the Iranians attempted to run the oil fields on their own. And then in 58 and 59, they realized that they didn't have the technical wherewithal to do that. And so they invited Americans to come and do the technical work, but under very different economic considerations than what the Brits had extracted out of the Shah's regime in the post-World War II era. So we were there, and my dad was working in the oil business, and I was a kid. I was probably, 10 or 11 years old at the time. I learned a little Farsi then, and I saw some of the good and some of the bad of life in Khuzestan province, which is the southernmost province.
What did you say?
Well, down near Abadan and at the head of the Gulf, not the southernmost province in Iran. So that gave me a feel for Iran. And then later I did become an avid skier. And when the Army said, would you like to be a foreign area officer, which is a specialist in a nation, and Iran was on the list, those two things came together. And I said, well, and a third thing came together, and that was clearly, at least in the mid-70s, we're talking 1977 when I made this decision, we were still in the midst of the Cold War and trying to ensure stability in the Middle East. Iran is a linchpin in that stability because it's one of the only countries that borders on Russia in the north and has warm water ports to the south. And so the calculus was that Iran would be important to us for a long time. Nobody knew at the time how important or how twisted the relationship would get, but it was good while it lasted.
John and Kevin both, what do you make of the lessons that this whole thing gives us as far as Iran and U.S. relations, which are still at a very, very bad point, and how could we maybe improve these in the future?
I'm not at all sure that we can improve them in the short term. My personal belief was that I was stunned to see that during the last administration, we were able to achieve the agreement on the Joint Comprehensive JCPOA plan of action on the Iran nuclear deal. Mm-hmm. And that was as close as we, in my opinion, have ever come to beginning a pathway towards normalizing relations. And of course, we have backed away from that. And then we took it upon ourselves to kill Soleimani. And I can't see the Iranians coming around, getting even back to the JCPOA for a decade or more. And by then they'll have their coveted nuclear weapon, and the game will be played completely differently. So I am very pessimistic about any kind of rapprochement, regardless of who the next president is, and the one after that, and the one after that. What we have always seen in the relationship prior to the JCPOA was what Ambassador Langdon used to refer to as mutual demonization, and what I refer to as paralysis from the fringes, meaning that the Iranian right wing and our right wing all through the 70s, 80s, and 90s and 2000s would take it upon themselves whenever there was any opportunity for rapprochement to demonize the other to the point where their own political system could not stomach any kind of rapprochement. And I was stunned during the JCPOA negotiations that that didn't happen on our end. And of course, as soon as we had our most recent election, it did happen. So we are where we are, but I wouldn't be holding my breath.
Yeah, and I would just add one thing, and that is that in any negotiation, whether it's in a family, a business deal, or in dealings between governments, you need two honest brokers. And there have been many times when the other sides, whether it's the US looking at the Iranians with or without intermediaries, or the Iranians looking at the United States, where both sides felt that the other was not offering an honest broker relationship.
Well, what's such a shame is if you visit Iran, like I have a number of times, is there among the people, there's such positive feeling about the United States, and that the United States has behaved very badly toward them in some ways. Just on a people-to-people level, there's great, amity. And it's just such a shame that these governments in both countries sort of just keep throwing obstacles in the path of there being any rapprochement, as James was speaking about. But I hope that things like this film can get out there and show people the reality of the past in order that we can sort of deal with that and process it and understand it. Barbara, do you think you'll get to show the film in Iran?
I don't know, but we had an Iranian crew that were two women, Galore and Kati. They came to the Toronto Film Festival, and they found some pretty extraordinary people, like the 11-year-old boy who was on the bus who told his story and saw such horrors, but what kept him going was he couldn't wait to get back to his classmates and tell them the story. So I would like to be able to show it there. And I think for me, it is a much fuller and more complex and more rich film because we do have the Iranians in there from the Revolutionary Guard and people who still feel the same way. So we're really getting a sense from all angles of what's happening.
Right. I think it's very fair to the Iranians. That's my impression. And I think Iranians would like to see this film. So I hope you do have a chance to show it there. And while I was talking about Iranians, let me, before I get cut off again, give a shout out to my friend Zartosh Soltani, who did your animation. Which I think
Z.
Yes, we call him Mr. Z.
Mr.
Yeah.
Z.
Very talented.
He's very talented, and we worked him very hard.
I know you did.
Eric would show him, pictures of helicopters from that time that he would have to duplicate. And, we'd spend late nights with him.
Right.
Yeah, and the amazing story, Godfrey, that Z probably told you just very briefly is he grew up in Iran. He was living in Iran at this time, and as a young boy would be asked to draw images in his, third grade or fifth grade history class. So this was a chance for him to revisit those memories in a new way.
Yeah.
And Eric, while I've got you, tell us about what were the most challenging aspects of this production for you.
Getting access to President Carter was very tough, and that goes to Barbara and Barbara's credit. Filming in Iran was very complicated as well, but thankfully we had this wonderful team of female filmmakers on the ground who helped us navigate. Besides, once those two pieces came into place and we got the tapes, under the helm of wonderful editor Francisco Bello and the editorial team and Z and the people at History. It was really just a wonderful creative effort to put all the little, pieces together. And, and Wendy Blackstone, composed a beautiful score, and, everybody was brought their A game. So it really shows on screen.
Yeah, we had a wonderful, wonderful people. And I can tell you the story of Carter if you want to hear it.
Sure, yes, I'd love to hear that.
All right. So we knew that we had to do this film and have Jimmy Carter, but we weren't getting anywhere. And I would call the Carter Foundation and, leave messages for this guy named Philip Wise, and he would never call me back. So what I decided to do was to have a relationship with his voicemail. And so I would call, every couple of days, tell him what we were filming, tell him how important this was, and just leave message after message after message. And finally, after 3 months, he called me and he said, "Hi, Barbara, this is Philip Wise." And I said, "Yeah, I'd know your voice anywhere." And he said, "We're going to let you come." And he said, "You can come February 14th and you can have 20 minutes with President Carter." And we were ecstatic. I found the best chocolate that I could to bring him for Valentine's Day, and a beautiful little heart from South Sudan that the women had made, a red heart for his wife. And he gave us 19 minutes and 47 seconds, and it was worth all of it. And we have almost all of it in the film.
That's a great story, and I'm so glad you got that, because I think he's a kind of a heroic guy, and he really, this is so much a part of his story that it's great to have him telling his part of the story.
Yeah. And, and also, Vice President Mondale and Ted Koppel, who shares my name but spells it wrong. And it was funny when I was interviewing him, because we'd say, "Hey, Koppel, hey, Koppel." But, he made his career out of Nightline. And
Absolutely.
That was one of the historic facts of doing this film, besides, Carter losing to Reagan, the whole beginnings of the special forces, so many different, historical parallels came together in making this.
Right.
Iranian Revolution, a lot of things.
Yeah. Were there any interviews you wanted that you didn't get?
I think there may have been one, because people were just tired of thinking about it.
My mom.
No, your mom wanted to do it, but she wasn't feeling well when we
Right, that was the one you didn't get to do, one of them at least.
Yes, but not because she didn't want to.
True.
Yeah, because that was very disappointing for me. I would have loved to have met her, but
there were so many different parts of the military that, deserve a voice. The Rangers were involved, and et cetera, but we could only, there's only so much screen time, so we could only include, as many as we could. And hopefully we got some of the key decision makers. Colonel Seifert, the captain of the lead helicopter, who ultimately had to work with Beckwith to call the abort, was an important interview.
Yeah.
And some people who I won't mention, who said, "No, I don't want to be interviewed." And then they saw the film and they said, "What a mistake we made."
I'm sure.
Would love to have been interviewed.
I'm sure they did. Well, congratulations to all of you. And Barbara, before we wrap up, do you want to say what's going to happen with the theatrical release of the film, you and Eric, and also when it will be on History Channel?
Well, I think everything on that is really up in the air right now. We'll have a conversation with them, and hopefully in the fall, if it doesn't show in theaters, maybe it'll be streaming. We're not sure. We have to figure that out, because we don't know when theaters are going to open again.
Yeah.
But we're very excited to have it at a drive-in movie or streaming or whatever needs to be done to get this film out as much as we can. And then 6 to 8 months after that, I guess History will show it.
Right. Well, maybe there's some drive-in theaters out there near Ashland that people can go see it in a second.
Well, that would be wonderful. Or restart. I used to love to go to drive-ins when I was a kid. So.
Absolutely.
You don't have to climb in the trunk this time.
No, definitely not.
Not that I know anything about that, of course.
Of course, not a bit.
Well, thank you all for this conversation, and thank you for the film, and good luck with it going forward.
All right, and thank you for being a great interviewer and persisting. It meant a lot to us.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right,
Good to see all of you.
really
Good to see you, Kevin.
Take care.
Everybody else as well, Eric.
Stay safe. Thank you. Thanks for the
Stay
festival.
safe too.